This is the second part here of chapter 4. So starting in section 4.4 and just how we get carbohydrates in our body. All right, our starch and sugar digestion actually starts in the mouth, so it really doesn't stay there long. But cooking will help soften that fibrous tissue, so it makes it, of course, easier to chew, swallow, and digest. But we do have different enzymes that are in the mouth, as well as the pancreas and the small intestines, that help with breaking down that food. Starting here in the mouth, so salivary amylase breaks down starch. Remember, starch is amylose and amylopectin. So it breaks down that amylose into smaller units. So like the disaccharides, like maltose, breaks it down into the 2-glucose. Again, the more we chew it, the prolonged chewing actually gives it a sweeter taste, because it allows time for that amylase to work and release the glucose that is then detected as sugar. If we don't chew it very long, our mouth doesn't release the glucose, so it doesn't taste as sweet. Now, looking more at the more complex carbohydrates, so the starch gets digested to maltose by that amylose. So again, amylase, so it breaks it down into 2 glucose molecules at a time, or that maltose. So again, the salivary amylase, as well as the amylase released by the pancreas. And then those disaccharides are digested into monosaccharides. So again, different enzymes. So lactase, as the name implies, digests lactose. Sucrase digests sucrose, and maltase digest maltose. So again, we have a different enzyme for all the different types of carbohydrates. And of course, our non-digestible ones, we don't have enzymes for. All right, so just a nice little summary figure here that looks at where these different enzymes are coming from. So again, starting with the mouth. So again, some of the starch, it doesn't stay there very long, but that salivary amylase breaks it down to maltose. Again, the liver and the gallbladder. So that's going to convert a lot of those monosaccharides. It gets converted into glucose and then into the bloodstream. The pancreas releases that pancreatic amylase, again, breaks down the complex carbohydrates into maltose. The stomach, that salivary amylase from the mouth becomes inactivated by the pH. So there's really not any digestion that's happening with carbohydrates in the stomach. It's too acidic. Then in the small intestine, though, there are lots of enzymes released there that'll break down the disaccharides into the monosaccharides. And then the large intestine, this is where that soluble fiber gets fermented by some of those bacteria, so it produces different acids and gases in the large intestines. And then that insoluble fiber escapes the digestion period and is excreted in the feces. All right, so if we look at a couple issues that can occur, so there's lactose maldigestion or intolerance, and these are due to a reduction in the enzyme lactase that is used to break it down. So therefore, lactose is undigested and not absorbed. So instead, it gets metabolized by those bacteria in the large intestine. They release gas during that process, so that leads to bloating, cramping, and diarrhea. So there's primary lactose maldigestion. This is, again, that reduction of lactase, but has, again, no apparent reason for that. And then the secondary lactose maldigestion is a reduction due to a specific cause. So for example, diarrhea. So if the food just isn't in the digestive system long enough, it's not going to be digested properly because there just wasn't time to do so. And then if there's a severe case of that where there's just very little breakdown or digestion, then it's termed lactose intolerance. Now the carbohydrate absorption, so once it is digested, absorbing it, only the monosaccharides are absorbed. Only they can go through the cell membrane because the other ones are just too big. So back to our monosaccharides, glucose and galactose. Typically active absorption, again, that's where energy is used and it's going from a low to high amount. So it needs that carrier protein and it needs energy. Fructose is more by facilitated, so we still need the carrier because it can't cross by itself, but it doesn't need energy. It's just going from a high to low concentration. And then both galactose and fructose get metabolized by the liver into glucose. Again, the liver's one of its jobs is providing that. So it releases that glucose into the bloodstream to be transported, especially to our brain, but then our other major organs like the muscles, kidneys, and our fat tissue, if there's too much and it needs to be stored as fat. It also produces glycogen to store that. So again, glycogen, that branched complex carbohydrate of glucose. It gets made in the liver if we have too much of it. And again, it produces fats whenever we have more carbohydrates consumed than what we actually need. The fiber in intestinal health, again, that insoluble fiber that we talked about in the other video, again, it passes but is not broken down. So again, the health benefits are to the colon as the nutrients present in the fiber like vitamins, minerals, and phytochemicals and some essential fatty acids, those do get absorbed and released. We're just not breaking down the carbohydrate part. Then the soluble fiber, the different bacteria that's in the gut is going to ferment it. So it produces various acids and gases from it, and those can be absorbed to some level, but again, much less, only about 1.5 kilocalories per gram. So again, those bacteria, those good bacteria are helping us to break down carbs we can't normally break down. So again, kind of highlighting those microbiomes. So again, one of the functions of them is to consume carbohydrates. So again, they are breaking down, it's taking those indigestible carbs that are found especially in our fruits and veggies, and it actually breaks those down. Now there are specific ones, so they're called MAX, microbiota accessible carbohydrates. So just like our cells, they have specific ones they can break down, and others they can't break them down either. So there are some foods called MAX. Those contain carbohydrates that our bacteria in our stomach or in our intestines can break down, and it improves our overall health, helps reduce inflammation, supports immunity, and even positive mental health. Now there are also the FODMAPs. We've mentioned these earlier in this semester. So these are fermentable, again, meaning they can be fermented or broken down by the bacteria. Oligosaccharides, disaccharides, monosaccharides, and polyols. So these include things like fructose, lactose, different fructans that are in wheat and garlic and onions, galactans in the legumes. The polyols are what are the sugar alcohols. So again, some individuals, those are poor digesters of these, and it's mainly going to lead to some gas, bloating, and diarrhea. So to improve that, having diets that are low in those fermentable carbohydrates are better, and it can help individuals with irritable bowel syndrome. All right, so now putting these carbs to work and actually getting energy. All right, so if we look at our main monosaccharide, or glucose, of course, its main job is to provide energy. Red blood cells in the brain can only use glucose. Now the brain, though, while it prefers glucose, can use these molecules called ketone bodies that come from a partial breakdown of a glycerol that's made up of our fats and our triglycerides, but again, preferably glucose. Again, by having glucose, it helps spares proteins. Our proteins are mainly for building blocks. So as long as we have enough glucose, then it prevents those proteins from having to be broken down. And also having enough glucose prevents ketosis. So again, because the brain has to have energy, it prefers glucose, but if it has to, it will go and rely on those ketone bodies. However, as long as we have an adequate carbohydrate, as long as our brain has enough glucose, it doesn't have to do that. So it doesn't have to break down fats to produce those ketones for energy. And because too many, the breakdown of too many ketone bodies can alter our pH and cause a lot of problems. And now, how does the body regulate glucose? So especially this is leading us into our discussion about diabetes, but a lack of glucose control produces hypoglycemia or hyper. So hypo meaning low, so hypoglycemia is low blood sugar or blood glucose, and then hyperglycemia is high glucose. So hypo is mainly below 40 to 50 milligrams per 100 milliliters of blood, and then hyper is more than 125 milligrams. So anywhere between 50 and 125 is kind of a normal glucose level. All right, now what controls that? So the liver regulates the glucose entering the bloodstream, but we rely on the hormones from our pancreas to release insulin and glucagon that are going to use that glucose that's in the blood. So the liver gets it to the blood. Insulin and glucagon help control how much is in the blood. So the release of insulin, this is going to tell cells to increase the glucose, so it's taking it out of the blood. And that means we have a lot of glucose, so it's going to store that as glycogen. And then it also reduces the conversion of amino acids to glucose, which is a process called gluconeogenesis. So as long as there's plenty of glucose around, we want to store what we have available as far as glycogen. Our cells are told to take it into those cells, either to store it or use it. And then we also want to decrease the production of glucose from other molecules like our proteins. Then glucagon has the opposite effect, so it's going to raise the blood glucose. So this would be like in between our meals where sugar level drops in the blood. So it's going to break down glycogen. It's going to release those individual glucose, so that gets released from the muscle in the liver where it's stored to increase the amount of glucose in the bloodstream, and it'll enhance that gluconeogenesis, so using amino acids to make glucose. All right, so looking kind of at times of stress. So again, in between meals, we think about the sugar changing, but also stress can affect this. So our fight or flight, so our adrenal glands release epinephrine or adrenaline. And what this molecule does is it causes the liver to break down glycogen into glucose. So it's going to provide fuel. So if we're running away or fighting against something, we need energy. So ultimately, epinephrine or adrenaline raises that blood glucose similar to insulin, but it doesn't do all the other things as well. So again, just a nice little summary figure here that's looking at how the glucose gets regulated. So again, if we have elevated glucose level, so again, too much blood glucose, we're going to release insulin, and then insulin is going to transport that glucose into the cells, so that level is going to drop as it goes into the cells. Also, that glucose gets stored as glycogen. So again, it's taking it out of the bloodstream to kind of normalize that blood glucose. All right, now also the opposite effect though is then whenever it gets too low, so in between our meals, now that the blood glucose is too low, now the pancreas releases that glucagon. It's going to increase gluconeogenesis, increase the breakdown of glycogen to glucose, and that's going to put the glucose back into the blood. So again, insulin gets it out of the blood, glucagon adds it to the bloodstream. All right, a couple terms here. Glycemic index, or the GI, is the ratio of blood glucose in response to a given food. So how much glucose gets released from a specific food. So it's compared to the response to a reference, such as glucose or white bread. So against a reference point. So high GI or glycemic index foods raise the blood glucose more than like a normal, so more than a medium or low glycemic index food. So again, it's a comparison that is given. So if a lot of glucose gets released from the food, like starchy foods or alcoholic beverages, they have a high glycemic index. If they have not a lot of carbohydrates, they would have a low glycemic index. And then the term glycemic load is just the measure of both the quality and the quantity of a carbohydrate in a meal. So again, like fruits that have a lot of cellulose or that soluble fiber, they have a lot of carbohydrates, but they're not really increasing the amount of glucose in the blood because we're not digesting them. So again, both the quality, the glycemic index, as well as the quantity, how much of that carbohydrate makes up the glycemic load. All right, so now looking at our fiber, and again, the importance, so it helps reduce the absorption of cholesterol and it helps decrease our chances of obesity. So again, that soluble fiber, thinking about like especially oats, but barley again being the number one, reduces the absorption of cholesterol. So just because cholesterol is coming in doesn't mean we absorb it. That soluble fiber helps prevent absorption. It also degrades fatty acids that help reduce the synthesis or production of cholesterol, and it slows glucose absorption and decreases insulin resistance or insulin release as well. And then those high fiber foods also help fill us up, so it decreases the overall calories that we need to maintain our normal loads. All right, so then looking at our carbohydrate needs, so the recommended daily allowance or RDA of carbs, again, about 130 grams a day, of course, based on a 2,000 kilocalorie diet. So the acceptable macronutrient distribution range, so it should be about half, so 45 to 65% of our total kilocalories in our food should come from carbohydrates. So again, about 55% of calorie intake. Those dietary guidelines are mainly to have a base intake of carbs that is based on fruits, vegetables, again, those whole grains, breads and cereals, as well as beans. And then to limit, so to decrease the refined grains, again, starchy foods like our potatoes and pastas, and especially things with added sugar, so like our sodas and that type of, or energy drinks or coffee. All right, this is just kind of looking again at those recommended dietary guidelines, just again limiting the intake from added sugars to less than about 10%, to increase the grains, so they should be at least half as whole grains, so all of the grains, at least half of that should come from whole grains, having a variety of those vegetables to give us lots of different phytochemicals and lots of different carbs. And then also using especially whole fruits to decrease those added sugars in the fruit juice, but to include fruits for our carbohydrates as well. So then looking at the amount of fiber we need, so again, our AI, meaning again, not quite enough information to make it a dietary value, but about 25 grams per day for women, a little bit more for men because their metabolism's higher. So again, you have for every 1,000 kilocalories, the goal would be about 14 grams of fiber there. Now, the dietary value that is given for the 2,000 kilocalorie diet is 28, so double that. For those, the average U.S. intake, more than about 90% and more than of women and 97% of men do not meet those recommended intakes of fiber. So increasing fiber in our diet is extremely important and beneficial. It is possible, though, to have too much fiber, so high fiber dietary patterns. The reason for that is that extra fluid is needed because, again, it's absorbing or moving those through the digestive system. So it may actually decrease availability of some minerals if we have too much fiber that's in there. So how much sugar is too much? Again, this is one of the things we want to limit. So dietary guidelines, the upper limit is about 10% of our total daily calories from added sugar. Max is about 50 grams for a 2,000 kilocalorie diet. diets above that upper limit, they're more likely to have deficiencies in nutrients needed for growth. So that upper limit from the American Heart Association, so that UL is 100 kilocalories for women and 150 for men. Again, above that, we're starting to see some negative impacts to our health. Again, just kind of thinking of where these added sugars are. Again, these are things we want to limit or avoid. Again, 24%, the majority comes from those sugar sweetened beverages. Again, coffees, energy drinks, sodas, but also our desserts and our snack cakes, different breakfast and cereal bars. So you may be getting like your barley or oats there, but you're also getting that added sugar. So watching that nutrient label is really important. Of course, candy and sugars just by themselves, about 9%. Sandwiches, thinking about the bread that's there, coffees and teas. Again, those sugary beverages, about 11% there. So again, just trying to limit all of these or reduce them as much as we can. So reducing those, especially at the grocery store, so some things to look for. So of course, read the nutrient list that's on there. Look for all the forms of added sugars, again, including the corn syrup. Again, because yes, it does provide that sucrose, but it is added sugar. So buying unsweetened versions of foods like cereals and applesauce, again, canned fruits, they have those added sweeteners. Again, look for labels that say no added sugars or that say they are unsweetened. And then buy nuts and unsweetened dried fruits to replace our candies for snacks. And this is just kind of highlighting some things you want to look for on your nutrient facts. So if we look at, this is two different types of cereal, but if you look, the total calorie is the same for both of these foods, but they definitely are not equal. So if we look at a few things, a couple things that stand out, the sodium, you see 300 milligrams of sodium on the one on the left, only 60 the one on the right, indicating you might want to stick with the one on the right. Then if we keep moving down, total carbohydrates, again, more on the one on the left, less on the one on the right. But then again, the biggest difference though is that there is much more dietary fiber that's in the one on the left, which is a good thing. Very little dietary fiber on the one on the right. Also, if we look at total sugars, 16 grams on the one on the left, 20 the one on the right. Again, if we look at these added sugars, only 10 grams, the one on the left, 15, the one on the right. Protein's about the same. So, you know, whenever you're looking at these, you have, so neither one of them are great. However, whenever you want to make some of these comparisons and make some good decisions whenever you're looking at foods, and kind of paying attention not just to the total calories, but looking at all of these other factors down through here. These are just some suggestions for reducing the sugar in foods that are made at home. So trying low sugar recipes or just adjusting the recipe by yourself. So start, you know, reducing it gradually until you've reduced it by about a third or more. So add sweetness by using different flavors or spices. So vanilla, so adding it doesn't increase the calories, but makes it taste sweeter. Also citrus zest, cinnamon's another good one. Cardamom, coriander, nutmeg, ginger, and mace. All of those are flavors or spices that can be added to food. Kind of gives it that sweet taste, but we can replace or decrease some of the sugar to help with that. Some other ways to do that. So again, choose fewer foods that have a lot of sugar in them. So if you're, you know, everything in moderation, but especially prepared baked goods and sweet desserts like different cakes, like Little Debbie cakes and that type of thing. So trying to decrease the number of those or eliminate them altogether. Again, using fresh fruit instead of cookies or candy for dessert or in between meal snacks. Include more protein like eggs and turkey for our healthy fats. Use nuts or seeds or some olive oil to decrease the desire for that sugar. Just add less sugar to foods in general. So if you're sweetening foods, so don't add or decrease the amount you add to your coffee or tea or to cereal. Reducing the use of white and brown sugars, honey and molasses, syrups, jams, and jellies to decrease that sucrose level. Using sugar alternatives sparingly because, again, while they decrease our calories, they also increase our desire for sweet food. So just trying to limit the sweetness altogether is better. And then, of course, substituting water for those sugary soft drinks, teas, etc., to really decrease the amount of added sugar. So sugar and hyperactivity, there's a wide belief, and maybe you're one of the individuals who believe this, that high sugar intake causes hyperactivity. So especially like in ADHD. However, studies show that sugar did not affect children's behavior. So expecting sugar to affect a child can actually influence a parent's interpretation of what they see. So, if a parent gives somebody or they know that they've eaten something sugary, they're almost kind of looking for them to be hyperactive. So it kind of skews our idea. Other factors associated with that include just normal temperament, emotional disturbances, learning disorders, sleep problems, or overstimulation can also be an issue. Not very likely that it's due to sugar. All right, so whenever we talk about sugar, we also look at our oral health, especially cavities. So starchy foods that can be fermented in the mouth, that increases our chances of having cavities, so especially white bread and crackers. Those cavities are caused by erosions on the surface of our teeth, mainly due to acids, as the bacteria in our mouth are breaking down or metabolizing the sugar in the foods. So then the sticky gummy foods that have a lot of sugar also promotes those cavities. And then fluoride water and toothpaste are of course used to prevent those cavities. So then wrapping up this chapter, talking and kind of focusing on diabetes here. So some of the symptoms of diabetes, and these can occur suddenly or in maybe one or two, or they can take a long time. Some of the most common: extreme thirst, frequent urination, drowsiness, lethargia, some problems with vision, an increased appetite, sudden weight loss, sugar in the urine, kind of a fruit sweet breath odor, heavy breathing, and then to the extreme would be a stupor or unconsciousness due to that extreme glucose in the blood. So there are two different types of diabetes. Type 1, this is often in children, and there is a link to genetics. This is actually where the body stops making insulin altogether. So it's typically due to an autoimmune disease where the immune system breaks down the cells in the pancreas that make insulin. So these individuals have to be given insulin because they can't make it on their own, and they have to monitor their diet. So these insulin pumps, like the one shown here, are required for them to get insulin because they have no way of making it. Now, type 2 diabetes, this is much more common. So after the age of about 30, though that age keeps decreasing. Here, insulin is being made, but those insulin receptors that receive the signal of insulin on the surface, especially those in the muscle and fat, they become resistant. So the insulin may be there, but the receptors aren't receiving it as well. And there is a link to this type and obesity or being overweight. So the treatment for that is decreasing weight loss. Different medications can be used, regulating diet, and in some cases, insulin is needed to treat it as well. So this is just showing insulin resistance. So again, normal is if there's a lot of glucose being absorbed by the small intestine, the pancreas would release insulin, and then that insulin tells our cells in the liver to take up the glucose. So it comes out of the bloodstream and gets stored in our muscles or stored in the liver. With insulin resistance, though, that glucose level increases, insulin gets released, but our body doesn't respond. So insulin's there, but our muscles and our liver cells are just resistant to it. And this is just kind of a nice little summary table here comparing these two. Again, type 1 is much less common than type 2 diabetes. Again, type 1 is due to an autoimmune disease, whereas type 2, it's resistant to the insulin. Risk factors for type 1 is that genetic predisposition, whereas type 2 is more due to diet, but there is also a genetic component as well. Again, the distinct symptoms like the frequency of thirst, urination, weight loss, and especially in younger kids, are typically more pronounced when no insulin is being made. Whereas with type 2, the symptoms are typically much more mild. So the treatment, again, type 1, they have to have insulin because that's what they're missing. But diet and exercise can also help as well. Whereas with type 2, diet and exercise become more prominent, but medicines, and in advanced cases, insulin can be given as well. And then there are the same complications that can occur due to those high levels of glucose, despite which type. Other infections or other issues arise from that. So monitoring the blood glucose is important in both of these individuals. And this is a test that can be done called the glucose tolerance test. So a person who has poor glucose control, they would be given glucose here at a certain point in time, and then their glucose levels are monitored, and you can see in both individuals they go up. As you would expect, blood glucose would go up when someone is given insulin or given glucose. However, typically that levels out and comes back down because insulin is released and our cells take it up. However, if somebody is insulin resistant or they don't produce insulin, those glucose levels remain high. There's also a pre-diabetes. So this is a condition kind of before diabetes, but it's kind of indicated by an increased concentration of glucose drifts to the upper end more than it does so to normal. So it's not quite to the level of diabetes yet, but definitely a little higher glucose than what would be expected. This is also called impaired fasting glucose. So it's diagnosed, again, if that glucose remains in the upper limit, so closer to the 125 per deciliter. So then there are some prevention programs. Was a large study that was done to look for early detection of diabetes risk, so that especially if prediabetes was indicated, a lot of lifestyle changes can be made to prevent diabetes from actually becoming an issue. And then the opposite end, hypoglycemia. So diabetic hypoglycemia, this is whenever there's too little glucose in the body, and this happens whenever diabetics use insulin, but they use too much. And so now, yes, their blood glucose dropped, but it went too low. And so this can occur, especially if they're not eating frequently enough. Again, that insulin is continuing to be delivered, and it's sucking up glucose. But if you're not eating enough to keep those levels normal, they can exhibit kind of some shakiness, sweating, palpitations, anxiety, and hunger. So they typically treat that by eating some carbohydrate containing food. So drinking a soda or eating a candy bar or chocolate or something that has a lot of sugar in it, just to get those levels back up. And then finally, we have what's referred to as metabolic syndrome. So some of the contributing factors that lead to this metabolic syndrome, so hypertension, having low HDL, which is the good cholesterol, having high blood glucose, high levels of triglycerides or fats, low or little physical activity, a large waistline from abdominal obesity, having a lot of refined sugar in their diet, and a low fiber in the diet. So all of these can lead to this metabolic syndrome, which is essentially where the blood pressure is too high, we don't have enough HDLs, that glucose levels kind of at the higher end our fat levels are too high, and again, we see some obesity. So that all of those, if all of those are present, it leads to this metabolic syndrome.